the whole Jimmy Carter wearing a sweater thing, like, gave people the wrong sort of feeling as Americans, and then when Reagan came in, he was like, "You don't need no stinking sweater, right? You could burn as much as you want whenever you want, because gosh darn it, it's your right." Like, I feel like that's the biggest problem with efficiency, is it feels like you're going without, like, it feels like you're actually sacrificing. Hello, Jigar Shah here, clean energy entrepreneur.
And I'm Jamie Nolan, Clean Energy Communications Consultant, and this is Energy Empire.
All right, Jamie, it's already been a crazy, eventful year this year. We started the year with the invasion of a country in our hemisphere and the removal of a president and his wife. And I don't know. Like, I feel like everyone keeps saying it's an oil story, and it is a little bit of an oil story, but we sort of wanted to get an expert's take on it. And so we invited Kevin Book, who I've known for years and is the resident nerd on all of these things. And so it was great to have him on.
Yeah, what made you choose Kevin Book? Can you tell us a little bit about his background and why? I mean, I have heard he's the guy, but why is he the guy on these issues in DC?
Well, the thing about Kevin is he really is somebody who plays it straight all the time. He's not an oil guy. He's not a solar guy. He is an analyst. He's an analyst. And he doesn't sugarcoat it. He doesn't try to like spin it in a certain way. And that's why I think, like ever since, Dick Cheney and George Bush, he's been a fixture within, like the DC scene and is really relied upon by a lot of experts.
So, how important are we talking here? Were there names dropped? Like, are we talking about like some Oval Office phone calls or does he have a direct line onto Capitol Hill? Like, what's the situation?
He really is the guy. I haven't really read all of his logs or emails, so I don't know how far up it goes, but
Come on,
I would
Jigger.
say that
I want you to do that level of research. We need that prep.
but I do know that he's the guy that people talk to when they want to hear the straight scoop. So like when you think about national security potential, right? So like how is this going to be viewed by China or other countries around the world? How does the industry review these kinds of things, right? How does negotiations on trade, get impacted by these types of events? Like what is a 360-degree view? This is a guy who writes thousands and thousands and thousands of words and sends them out to his clients every week. And so he's on the record all the time.
hmm But what's your hot take on this issue? Like, I mean, I feel like the news media moves on so quickly these days. I mean, under a Trump administration, it's the flooding the zone really never ends, and it's so busy. The news cycle is so fast. Now that it's a few weeks behind us, what do you really attribute this move by the Trump administration to, and what's your take on what's going to happen next in Venezuela?
Well, I think as with a lot of things in the Trump administration, like I think there is a sense of uh, truth in what the president does, but like sometimes he just takes it too far. So it is very clear that the Russians have invested heavily in Venezuela and Venezuela's allowed them to. And the Chinese are taking all the oil and that is true, as well as like their financing of Cuba is real. And, in general, like the United States for a long time, certainly since Kennedy, but even before that with the Monroe Doctrine, has said that we don't want other powers in our backyard. And so I think a lot of this is just kicking out Russian and Chinese influence. I don't think getting to 4 million barrels a day again for Venezuela is in the cards. I think a lot of people have spent way too much time talking about that. But the million barrels a day that they produce now is going to be shifted from China to the Gulf Coast refineries that were all built to process Venezuelan crude. And so what people don't realize is that a refinery can't just process any kind of crude oil. They actually are specifically made for certain types of crude oil. So a lot of our refineries in the Gulf Coast are processing Canadian heavy crude. And now like they'll be processing sour Venezuelan crude. And I think when you think about what that means for the negotiations with Canada and the reopening of our trade negotiations, I think Trump expects to have a heavy hand by saying, we don't need your oil anymore. We have 1 million barrels a day from Venezuela, being processed in those places. But also, I think the thing that people don't really understand right now is that the the Chinese are actually huge importers of oil, even though they've done a great job of moving to electric vehicles and they are trying really hard to reduce their oil consumption. They still use a lot of oil, right? And so the fact that they get cheap oil from Russia, cheap oil from Iran, and cheap oil from Venezuela is something that they rely upon. And so, getting cheap oil out of their hands, I think, is a big deal. And I think it does start to change some of the balance of power.
Thing that the Trump administration has pointed out and that we know to be true is that Venezuelan oil production has really plummeted, like the total number of barrels produced per year. Um, if you're a decision maker, if you're like a leader at a U.S. oil company, what are you thinking right now? Like, have you talked to any executives, that have a footprint in Venezuela? I mean, what are they thinking about the geopolitical risk involved in, expanding their footprint there?
Yeah, so when you think about what happened under Hugo Chavez, right, when he came in, he kicked all of the U.S. oil companies out, Exxon, Chevron, and we had loads from the Export-Import Bank into Venezuela. We had a lot of influence, and so we were able to force the Venezuelan government to pay back the U.S. government for those Exim loans, but all of the equity that was invested by Chevron or Exxon or others was wiped out, right? And so that was not great. Chevron was able to work out a slightly different side deal, so they still produce about 100,000 barrels a day of oil in Venezuela, and so they might be able to expand that a little bit. But I think that the broad memories of the people in the U.S. oil industry is that Venezuela is really not a safe place to do business. And so I don't think people are clamoring to put money in, certainly not the super majors. You can imagine a wildcat or entrepreneur doing that. But even there, this is really heavy oil. So like in general, the costs of getting this stuff out of the rock is not cheap. So, like with oil at 50 some like dollars a barrel right now, it's not a very profitable time to go into Venezuela and invest.
Mhm. So where does the buck stop on this? Like, say this doesn't work out and these American oil companies decide it's just not worth the risk. We're not going back into Venezuela when the next administration could completely change policy. We recently saw that Secretary Wright was the first senior administration official to make a trip to Venezuela. Does that put him at risk? Do you think that that makes him kind of the face of this effort? What do you think?
Well, I mean, the buck stops with Qatar, right? Since all the money I think is going into Qatar bank accounts and is being like run through Qatar, which I find weird. Like
Talk
I
about
don't
that a little bit more.
well, like all of the money, right, that we're using to like sort of that we collect when we sell the oil, right, is being held in Qatar. Then the Qatar is using that money to help rebuild Venezuela theoretically. I feel like it's hard to audit a
Mhm.
fund that's in Qatar, and so I don't really understand how the U.S. government gets away with doing that when we have perfectly good banks here in the United States to do that transparently. So like I think that causes a lot of questions. I don't know that I'm accusing anybody of anything yet, but I just think it's highly unorthodox to do things that way. It's one thing if it was a Muslim country and it was Palestine and they only trusted the Qataris, but I don't know why Venezuela would want Qatar in the middle. So I don't get it at all. But like the other big thing for me is that, you know, I think that, one of the big challenges that we have right now is we are in this interesting situation where we have very low oil prices with a lot of excess oil production capacity. And like that is causing oil prices to be low. And I think that's a great thing, right? That means people are paying a lot less for gasoline at the pump. And it means that it's not very profitable to drill in the Arctic or drill deep sea drilling or to do other stuff, right? So part of what's going on right now as well, while everybody's talking about Venezuela, is that we are deploying clean energy technology at such a scale that we have a lot of excess oil production. And I think that is also a good thing for consumers.
Great. And that brings us to one of the big topics that I know came up in this conversation with Kevin Book, which is the concept of nega barrels. Can you talk a little bit about that and how it relates to rising electrification?
Well, to be clear, that is like completely ripped off of Amory Lovins, who is the godfather of all nega, right? And so it started with negawatts, right? And like all the work that he's done on energy efficiency for years. And I think that we have had a cultural change in the United States where people really thought about energy efficiency as being the first fuel. I think in the oil industry, we have not seen that, right? So we have a whole bunch of technologies where we can dramatically reduce oil consumption around the world, whether it's electric vehicles, but also industrial efficiency and, uh, like solar and battery storage microgrids, right, for diesel and all sorts of other solutions, right? And what we're finding is that in general, most political leaders don't know how to deal with all of these new technologies. They don't know how to promote them. They don't know how to grow them really fast. And so as a result, they're stuck paying for oil imported into their country, which is money going out the door, right? Because oil is traded in US dollars. And for a lot of these countries, they don't have unlimited US dollars. And so when they use them to buy oil, that means they can't buy AI. They can't buy manufacturing equipment. They can't buy other stuff that is also sold in US dollars. And so the whole concept of nega barrels is really empowering a lot of these governments around the world to say, hey, if you really want to control your own destiny, you now have an ability to deploy these technologies that are fully under your control to reduce oil demand in your country, which then reduces oil prices, which makes everything easier for you and everybody else around the world.
Awesome. Well, I can't wait to learn more. Looking forward to hearing this conversation from Kevin Book.
This podcast is supported by S2G Investments. If you've been listening to me, you know that I am done talking about R&D. We have the technology. The question is, can we deploy it at scale? When I joined Sanjeev Krishnan on the S2G podcast, we skipped the hype and talked about what actually matters: affordability, fit for purpose capital, and getting real infrastructure built. S2G Investments is one of the only firms who brings that same deployment first mindset to energy, agriculture, and oceans, connecting the dots across the real economy. Listen to the S2G podcast on your favorite podcast app now and start with my episode on energy affordability. Kevin, welcome to the new podcast. Thanks for being here. You and I think, have known each other for a long time. I think we probably met around 2009 or, sometime around the global
Maybe even
financial crisis.
2007 or 2008, yeah.
I remember us fighting about like energy density in one of our first like hot topics. You were like, solar doesn't have enough density. And so we've been friends for a long time. But I don't know that I've actually like, really understood your career trajectory. You sort of, you graduated from Tufts. And what did you graduate in?
Economics with a double in English.
Okay. So is that what makes you a good writer?
My dad joked about that. He was like, "What are you going to do? Write about money?" And the answer is yes.
And then where did you go from college? Because you didn't immediately start a firm, right? So where did you go next?
I'd actually applied to law school, got in and deferred for a year. And on the advice of one of the attorneys who'd recommended me at the firm where I'd interned in college, I took that year and fell in love with research and strategy consulting at a firm called the Advisory Board Company. That
Okay.
led me to another consulting firm. I ended up with an 8-year hiatus, the last 3.5 years of which were at the Motley Fool, the personalfinance.com.
Totally. Did you pick the right 10 stocks?
I didn't always pick the right 10 stocks. I looked brilliant until we all stopped looking brilliant circa 2000.
So you became the go-to guy for politicians and others that actually want to have the straight scoop, right? And not just, have people tell them what they want to hear. When did that become a thing for you, right? Clearly, we had an energy vice president when Dick Cheney came into office with George W. Bush. And, he did his plan in 2001. And then He passed the Energy Policy Acts of 2005 and 2007. Like, when did you start to become an expert that politicians would call?
You know, I was very lucky to be, I guess, in circulation where they could find me, here in Washington. And so, when called, I answered. There were a couple of basic thoughts, that went into it. The first is that when anyone in our government, no matter which party they're in, no matter which part of the government they're in, asks for information, it's incumbent on us as citizens to try to give the best information we can. And so that's always been my approach. It's been our approach since we started Clearview in 2009. And it continues to bring questions, and when we can, we give answers. The second thing, though, also is that it's really an honor. It's a privilege to be able to inform, but it's also incredibly educational to learn what the people who are making decisions are wondering about and how they think about it. It's very easy to sort of distill and abstract from what you think people who are leading in political life are doing, but when they actually are asking you questions, it's an education like no other.
So now we fast forward into where we are today, right? Which I think is shaped by the Ukraine crisis, right? Which for me is the first crisis where energy efficiency played a role, right? Like, I mean, in the past, I think people thought that, yeah, maybe you'd wear a sweater, right? That was the whole Jimmy Carter, turn down the thermostat thing. But like, like in Ukraine, like we didn't just ship a lot more LNG to Ukraine. They deployed a huge amount of heat pumps and, and energy efficiency and insulation and all that stuff. And so, I mean, to me, that's the most undercovered part of that story, right? Is that all of this alternative stuff that people have been working on for a long time, solar and energy efficiency, et cetera, I think actually played a big role in an emergency situation.
Yeah, it's the fifth fuel, efficiency, that everyone talks about. It's also sort of underutilized most of the time. I think there's the academic notion of negative priced supply in some sort of abatement curve or supply curve that you draw, where efficiency plays a significant role in either adding supply or foregoing demand and thereby adding supply or reducing emissions. But why doesn't it happen? And usually there tend to be sort of real fixed cost or practical or regulatory barriers that prevent the uptake. Sometimes it's a relative price indifference on the end user's part. Sometimes it's the structure of the overseer regulator of the market. Sometimes it's structural impediments to new entry. But in this particular case, you had a very powerful catalyst for efficiency, and it did happen.
I feel like it's mostly vibes. Like maybe I'm wrong, but I feel like the whole Jimmy Carter wearing a sweater thing like gave people the wrong sort of feeling as Americans. And then when Reagan came in, he was like, "You don't need no stinking sweater, right? You could burn as much as you want whenever you want, because gosh darn it, it's your right." Like I feel like that's the biggest problem with efficiency is it feels like you're going without. Like it feels like you're actually sacrificing instead of getting a better product. And today, I think with technology like heat pumps and smart water heaters and smart thermostats and being able to mess with your appliances on your phone, like the features now feel like things that people want as opposed to doing without.
I think making things more user accessible is important, but there is I think you're right. Partly the vocabulary efficiency sounds like something like eating your broccoli or doing your homework that you're supposed to do, you maybe don't want to do, whereas economizing or profiting sounds a lot better. And so when you think about what it means for energy independence, which was, again, very much the language of the era until we reached our current state, that notion of getting through independence by starvation, by doing without, wasn't particularly popular. I think, Jigger, over the years you've known me, I've probably made hundreds of energy food analogies. I promise I'll keep doing it because it's just so apt. We all understand our innate need for food. We all understand our innate need for energy, and it relates pretty well, even when the technologies are very different. And so, the idea of trying to grow yourself to fitness through working out and muscle rather than starving yourself to environmental or economic rectitude was very appealing. It still is.
I mean, it's a great analogy for today, right? I mean, so many people on Ozempic these days, right? They're starving themselves. But, I mean, it is sort of is what it is, I guess. Build more muscle, people. All right. So when you think about independence, part of that feeling is what drives China, right? Because China felt like it had to import all of its oil, even coal, which it has. It was importing at very high prices from Australia for some time, right? Um, and so they sort of set off on this journey in the 2008, sort of 2010 timeframe of saying, how do we become more independent, right? And they built a bunch of manufacturing for solar, and they decided to go on this long journey for electric vehicles. They bought up a lot of our bankrupt battery companies in 2011, 2012. And, I think the Trump administration in 2016, provided some of that CFIUS approval for A123 and others. And so now we're in a place where they're dominating what some people call the electro state. Like, how do you view their journey of energy independence? And then, and then after that, there's seems to be a lot of countries that are saying now that China has lowered the cost of that journey, like they sort of want to take that journey.
Well, I think the easiest way to think about it is to sort of look at a number. Uh, Energy imports, net imports, as a share of total supply is probably an easy way to think about independence and energy captivity. When we were at our peak on a net import dependence basis in 2005, we were above 32% for total supply on a net import basis. That's a lot. And if you go back to the beginning of the century, China was roughly even. And they've now progressed to the point where they're about 25% net import share of supply, which is a lot. And so there's this natural economic and security mandate that applies that makes them think, well, where can we endogenously within our borders get energy? Where can we supply without these reliances that we have on globally priced variable cost petroleum risks? And one of the engines for independence for them wasn't to drill, but to engineer technologies that could provide them with electrification of transportation and industry, to provide alternatives in nuclear power, hydroelectric, dams so big they change the spin of the earth, and a massive deployment of renewable technologies, all in service of trying to get around that import reliance that's so vital to their economic growth, but also so risky in a world of, well, fragmentation, repartitioning, and new risks. So, they're consuming 16 million barrels per day of oil, give or take, importing 12 million barrels per day of that. That's a pretty big reliance. I think most countries that are in that position are looking at ways to diversify. We certainly were when we weren't even that far.
I feel like I should ask a follow-up question about the dams that are like changing the spin of the earth. So tell me more about how their large hydro dams are changing the spin of our planet.
We're getting outside my area of immediate expertise, but I've read from people who do understand it that the Three Gorges Dam was so significant that it so radically changed the weight distribution that the Earth moved a little bit on its axis, which is quite a thing. Good cocktail party conversation, but I don't have the kind of domain expertise to tell you more.
Are you saying that's what's causing climate change?
I mean, a couple drinks from now, I might say that, but I'm not saying that yet.
All right, all right. So China has a reason for investing heavily into all these things. It's not just economic, exports, et cetera, but it's also just, national security and and energy independence. And so now we get into Venezuela, right? And the story about Venezuela seems to be covered by most people that I listen to as an oil story. And I get that they're shifting 1 million barrels a day that's being produced right to Texas from, where it's now going to China. But it just seems so small ball. I can't imagine that that's what this whole thing was about. Like how do you read it?
Well, I think there's no way to describe Venezuela without talking about oil, given the centrality of oil to the Venezuelan economy and the essential role that oil will likely play in Venezuelan recovery or the restoration of democracy. So, in some ways, I think the oil story for Venezuela is very much in its rearview mirror for now. Its days of being a major producer in a world where there was a smaller oil market. We're in a 75 million barrel per day oil market, and they're producing 3.5 million barrels per day. A very big player. They were originally a founding member of OPEC in 1960. So they were one of the big dogs in the global oil market that decided that they were going to take supply management on as an obligation and opportunity. But it did change. It changed
Now they're
largely.
like a chihuahua.
Well, a Chihuahua and a Great Dane are both dogs, but they do play different roles. So I think that the story is about oil to the extent that getting more oil out of the ground, more revenue for the government, more economic distribution, and investment in the economy writ large probably is a major step for Venezuela. The Trump administration has explained themselves in several different ways, and one of the stories is not about oil. It's about a hemispheric sphere of influence, I guess a hemisphere of influence, if you will, reviving the Monroe Doctrine, expanding it a little bit. One way to think about it, just very sort of high level, is if the last administration, the one in which you served, was trying to address a fragmenting and repartitioning world by tightening alliances, this administration is responding by trying to make America bigger, trying to come up with ways to tighten ties, ensure sort of alignment within the hemisphere. And so I think that's part of the story too. And the two things can't be entirely separated given the importance of oil to Venezuela.
But that seems like a bigger part of the story. Like, I mean, Marco Rubio is pretty smart and has been on the Venezuela beat for, I don't know, probably since 2015, 2016, at least. Um, I mean, it feels like kicking the Chinese and the Russians out of our hemisphere is probably what Marco Rubio is focused on, right? And then separately, trying to figure out how we actually get Venezuela to play its historic role of being the economic engine of South America. And, having the vibrancy of their extraordinary people. And, they used to be some of the most educated people in South America, right? The most vibrant business people, et cetera. Like returning that culture and that opportunity back to the country, I think is what drives the Secretary of State.
I think there are several drivers and several engines at work at once. And, that may actually have worked out. The fact that the Secretary of State and the National Security Advisor are the same person eliminates one of the usual areas of difference that one sees in many administrations, where folks at Foggy Bottom have a different perspective on priorities than folks in the West Wing.
So when you say that the oil is going to be important, I don't think anyone believes we're going to get to 4 million barrels a day anytime soon, right? So it's really just the million barrels a day, and maybe it gets to 1.5 through, strategic maintenance and all that stuff. Um, so now that money is being provided by the United States, right? Because the oil is now being sold to U.S. refineries or will be in the future, right? And then that money goes into Venezuela. Donald Trump himself is running the country from what I can gather from True Social. So like how does this play out differently than Iraq? Like, I mean, I get the fact that they sort of left the number two in place. And so we're not really running the country, but like, how does this play out?
I don't know. I think we're going to have to see what the president intends to do when he says that he sees a potential role for Maria Corina Machado in government, and she's clearly an opponent and critic of Delcy Rodriguez, the interim president. Uh, One wonders exactly what the path to democratic transition will look like. When will there be an election, for example? A lot of investment depends not just on the geological circumstances or even the infrastructure, but the political plumbing, which probably needs to be changed before you'll get the kind of growth in oil production that's being discussed. And so you can't just do, the president has, I think, said what you said. He wants to see more oil production in the near term to facilitate the next stage in transition. That's certainly how Secretary Rubio has laid it out: stabilization, essentially before the next steps to recovery and ultimately transition to democracy. That's the way he laid it out. But so getting to the point where you get past the immediate footprint of incumbent producers, you encourage the investment of new capital, involves probably not just the structural reform of the oil regulation and law on the books in Venezuela, but to some degree, probably the democratic change. And we don't have clear visibility into how long that runway may be or how bumpy it might be. It could get in the way of takeoff.
So so now we've kicked out Chinese money, right? Because China was funding buying all the oil, right? So it was their money going into Venezuela. And now it's US money going into Venezuela because the US folks are paying for the oil. And so therefore the influence has changed. But at some point, a million barrels a day is a lot for the United States, right? So if we're taking on a million barrels a day, who are we taking off at a million barrels a day? Like who's shipping us a million barrels a day less because we're accommodating Venezuela?
Well, initially, we're probably not taking off as much as you might think. The way it works is that the refineries, as I think you know, in the Gulf Coast, are the ones that are best suited to process the heavy grade of oil, the sulfurous grade of oil that comes from Venezuela. And so they lost that Venezuelan crude stream in 2019 in January when the first Trump administration put the sanctions in place, and it never fully recovered it. Some of what they replaced it with were intermediate partially refined barrels from Russia. Part of what they replaced it with were different crudes of different grades and different descriptions. Some Canadian oil that usually goes into the upper Midwest made its way all the way down into the Gulf of Mexico. What it is likely to do is, at least initially, increase uptake of oil in that Gulf Coast refining region. And then, as the volume grows, if it grows significantly, it probably does crowd out, among other things, those marginal Canadian barrels. If nothing else, it forces a discount up in Alberta for the sellers who have to compete now with a sort of a flusher market in the Gulf of Mexico.
So you're saying that Trump and Carney are not going to be nice about this with each other. Like it feels like we already have a lot of tension between Canada and the United States. You're trying to say that the tension might go up a little bit?
Well, it's interesting, Jigar, because if you go back to the beginning of the century, the way people thought about oil in Canada was that it was an essential supplement to North American energy security. We encouraged, and in fact, as I think everyone recalls, tried to build more connection to their Western Canada sedimentary basin, where so much of those oil sands barrels could be produced and brought into the refining sector in the United States. And now we're looking at more of a hemispheric energy security template where it's not as clear that it'll go smoothly. We're looking ahead this year in July at the US Mexico Canada agreement being renegotiated per the original terms of the 2019 pact. And so at 6 years, they have a chance to look at it. I think both sides are likely to puff up and try to get as much collateral for deal making for deal making as they can ahead of that negotiation. Oil could be a part of that story.
So the pipeline I think you're talking about is probably the XL pipeline for
Keystone
those
XL,
who don't
830,000
know.
barrels per day. Yes.
Don't know what you were talking about there. And then so but dig in more deeply. I mean, it does feel like we're like heading towards a, Canadian bacon type situation, right? What was that movie with like John Candy? Was that John Candy? Um
I'm not sure I know the movie you're referring to.
where like he goes in and like invades Canada from like Vermont with all the Mounties. Such a good movie. Anyway,
On my
um
list.
like I guess what I'm trying to figure out is, so there's going to be a reopening of the trade agreement with Canada, right? And like it does feel like this is leverage for Trump, right?
It seems like it provides some leverage. It doesn't provide that much because, Canada is currently shipping us 4 million barrels per day, 3 million of which are the heavy sour crude that we're talking about. Even if you took all of the Venezuelan volume and brought it into the United States, it couldn't wholly displace that, but it could change the pricing dynamics for that marginal Canadian barrel sold. And I think Canada's well aware of that. They're trying to build conduits to the west to expand the Trans Mountain line to the west coast so they can ship to other markets and diversify their client base. They don't like this monopsonist customer they're substantially serving to the south, especially as relations seem to be getting a greater degree of friction. Now, these negotiations are negotiations, and I think it's reasonable to ask, like, well, what would the U.S. do without those Canadian barrels? I don't think it's a threat that Canada would carry out, but as a thought experiment, we are still a highly integrated North American energy security system, and I don't think we're really ripe for a sudden divorce. And so when you see the kinds of sort of moments where big tariffs come up, we then have had moments where there have been afterthoughts. So the original fentanyl tariffs that Trump imposed in February
I love
had a
how we
carve out.
call them the fentanyl tariffs.
Well, they were premised on the notion that they would prevent imports of fentanyl. So, as a matter of reference in the Supreme Court jurisprudence concerning those tariffs, they're being referred to as such. I'm just using the term of art that's in circulation.
Oh my God. Like, I mean, like at some point people are going to call things like the Narcan tariffs or the opioid tariffs, or, I mean, Lord Almighty. But in any case, all right. So then returning back to the original conversation that we were having around where all of this is going, it does feel like China has built up its electrostate. It now has the ability to export a lot of electric vehicles, I think several million electric vehicles a year. The Canadians have just agreed to sort of let them bring electric vehicles into Canada, right? I mean, I'm just trying to understand how complicated this gets, right? Like if you have electric vehicles going into Canada for like $13,000 a unit, right? Brand new. What happens to our like used car market in the United States? Like I don't like I guess I don't understand how complicated this gets. Like as China continues to dump electrostate products into other markets around the world, right? It feels like it has to reduce the pressure around oil consumption increases, right? I mean, like even emerging markets like Mexico, right, Brazil, India, Indonesia are now up to like 10% of all new cars being electric.
I think there's two parts to your question. One is the dumping part, and the second is the displacement part. Let's start with the dumping part. So it's not that easy to do when there's a 100% tariff in place, put in place by President Biden, and also a regulation, a non-tariff barrier barring Chinese software from vehicles, I think starting in 2027 or possibly 2028, but I think it's 2027. So these are limitations on the second part, which is the displacement effect. But let's talk about that displacement too. In mature markets where there's it's a relatively well saturated vehicle penetration, like the United States, like North America, like the OECD, uh, you you do see a different kind of demand for electric vehicles than you get in markets where there's a need for mobility and there's no incumbent source of that mobility at all. And low fixed cost acquisition of electrification is a solution. Uh, if you get to the point where you actually have a price competitive EV, uh, you have to wonder what will happen at the end of the next substitution cycle. We have Americans who are keeping their cars a lot longer. Maybe they can't get those Chinese vehicles because of those non-tariff barriers I mentioned. Canadians can. And what will happen to the Canadian ICEVs? There are dynamics that could really change. And when you look at what could happen to those Canadian ICEVs, we have auto tariffs in place right now, carve outs right now to manage some of the North American integrated supply chain, but trade complexity ahead for sure.
Yeah, I mean, like, like one of my favorite television shows on Hulu is that guy who like goes from El Paso, right, down into Mexico and picks up like, old ice cars and then like rebuilds them into muscle cars. I mean, like, that's a thing. Like, people do that. Like, I mean, cars go back and forth between Mexico and the US or the US and Canada. Like, are you really saying that, like, what is it, ICE now that's going to like police cars and make sure that like certain cars don't go over the border from Mexico to the United States? Or,
Did you just make an ice pun on ice vehicles?
I mean, I feel like when a guy's got game, you got to use it.
Well, look, I think that the displacement of fuel consumption is really the other part of the displacement, not just the vehicles taking the place of incumbent vehicles, which is a fraught proposition when you have industries the governments actively are trying to protect, and not just here, but also in Europe. So I think questions about penetration are limited by politics. But when you look at the economic effects right now, there are some differences that matter, like substitution of a US ICEV, replacing it outright with the same consumption and use pattern with an electric vehicle. For every million you put on the road in the United States, you eliminate about 32,000 barrels per day of liquids demand. We drive more miles. Our incumbent fleet has lower fuel economy than some of the other fleets. If you look at sort of globally, the displacement effect is closer to about 20,000 barrels per day. And in China, where they have less VMT per light duty vehicle, so fewer miles driven at higher efficiencies than the global average, it's closer to about 15,000 barrels per day. And so if you're looking at sort of the oil market impacts of EV penetration, then widespread penetration in the markets where you have sort of the biggest bang for your displacement buck would really change the sort of supply demand picture more than some of the substitution for foregone purchases that hadn't yet happened of future EVs that we're seeing in the Asian markets.
Yeah, but I guess what I'm like getting back to sort of the vibes that we're into now, right? For a long time, there was a feeling that oil was, something that was super sticky and that no matter how much the price went up, people just need to fill up their tank. And so they just had to eat it and do stuff. I feel like going forward, people have choices, right? Like if a government really wanted to go to war against oil imports, they've got a greater set of tools today than they did 10 years ago, right? Like Ethiopia has basically banned the import of internal combustion engine cars, not because they hate emissions, but just because they don't want to keep importing the fuel. And so they're like, we might as well like choke it off now so that we can, like reduce the amount of fuel imports we have to do in the future. And they have that big hydro dam. And so they've got excess electricity. So they're saying, let's do this, right? I mean, yeah, I guess what I'm trying to figure out is it feels like a bunch of world leaders feel more empowered today than they were 10 years ago to combat this energy independence, you know, goal.
Well, there are some questions about what you do when you make that choice that leaders have clearly, like Ethiopia, you mentioned, have weighed in on and decided already. But the variable cost risks that come from globally priced petroleum, and they're significant. I think we all know what happens when prices spike. Uh, are also up against the fixed cost risks associated with the transition metals and materials that go into electric vehicles. And arguably, as much as oil market risks have captivated people like me for decades, uh, the concentration of oil globally, the distribution of oil in any one country as a percentage of the total is less than the concentration of critical minerals processing in China, for example. And so the people who take the other side of that bet are saying, wait, there's a security risk here that you have to count, you have to think about. In addition to the diversification away from petroleum price risk, you have to think about transition metal and material risk.
But that feels very academic. It feels very Council on Foreign Relations or CSIS or whatever, right? Like, I mean, like if you're a world leader and you run Indonesia or you run, Nepal or like, aren't you just going to be like, screw it, let's do it? I mean, and so, I mean, aren't you just going to say like, BYD's offering me 100,000 electric vehicles. I'm going to buy 100,000 electric vehicles, right? Like, I mean, the critical minerals piece I get, right? So now there's concentration in China, and we obviously did a lot of that in the Biden administration, right? But that feels like heady, like, sort of academic conversation to a country that basically is just like, well, this feels a little more secure. And then on the broad critical minerals piece, my sense is we haven't even tried to reduce critical minerals exposure through efficiency yet. Like, people used to yell at me about the solar industry and how much of the global silver that we used to use. Today's solar panel uses 1/10 the silver that we did 10 years ago, right? And so like I'm pretty sure that the EV industry could use a lot less copper. They could use a lot less of some of these materials if the price triples.
So there's a couple of things wrapped up in what you just said. So prescient. I love these conversations with you. So I mean, first on the supply side alone, we had a moment in 2005 where the Chinese National Offshore Oil Company wanted to buy Unocal, the Union Oil Company of California. And one of the areas of concern was there was one critical minerals, one rare earths mine in Mountain Pass, California, the Molycorp mine, it was called at the time, that Unocal owned, and it had to be walled off, raised a lot of security concerns. That was 2005. It's 21 years later. It's still the Mountain Pass MP Materials now, it's called, is still the only operating rare earth mine in the United States. So we managed to go 2 decades without responding on the supply side. So maybe it's not that surprising you haven't seen that much response on the demand side in the uptake of critical minerals by a relatively new nascent industry like EVs. But maybe it's also, I think, that we're not necessarily as responsive to the risks that you're describing because we had a whole lot of oil under our feet and we got good at producing it. And here in the United States, our vision of energy security has looked and has started to look very different than some of the countries you're describing.
So are you worried that we're going to fall behind, that we're just so like sort of addicted to our, petroleum wealth that on our cheap natural gas prices that we're going to be late to the game on the electrostate? Like, I mean, it's very obvious that defense is going batteries, right, all day, right? I mean, drones and I mean, just look at Ukraine, and the conflict in Ukraine is all about like electrostate technologies, right? Um, and so, I'm curious whether you think that we're getting complacent because of our oil wealth.
I don't know that that's necessarily true. If you look at some of the countries with the most successful electric vehicle transitions, they're also oil producing nations. The Scandinavian countries with a history of oil production have managed to make that transition. There are also modes of engagement with these sectors that we've seen in the last administration and this one. Both presidents have had an affection for industrial policy, identifying strategic sectors and mobilizing government capabilities to try to develop them. And I wouldn't be at all surprised, given the importance of some of these sectors to this administration and to all future ones, that we wouldn't see some development, perhaps enabled by the fact that we have a relatively robust energy security platform right now with which to work. But in terms of actually substituting out the incumbent infrastructure, like why doesn't electrification work in the U.S.? And here I'm going to you already hit 2 of my affiliations, right? CSIS and CFR. But without at the risk of sounding nerdful and wonky, there's a Dutch social theorist named Geert Hofstede. I studied when I was in graduate school. He studied multinationals. He looked at companies that worked in different countries and used the idea that there was a monolithic corporate culture to distill the country-specific attributes. One of them was individualism versus collectivism. And guess which country was the top of the individualist ranks? The United States,
Of course.
closely followed by the UK. So, in highly individualist societies, particularly far flung, long distance driving ones like ours, you have a lot of what economists call race conditions or edge cases that start to influence the reasons why your consumer behavior might say no. It's not that you actually need to drive 300 miles every single day, it's that on any given day you might need to, or you might think that you need to. And then the uptake, the range anxiety that we still see plaguing widespread consumer purchases gets in the way. The second aspect of it, though, is economic, and it's very straightforward. I mean, the high fixed price delta for buying an EV is a barrier. And so whenever you see, like in the literature, which I'm sure you've seen over and over again, innovative financing, I believe you ran an agency that was involved in innovative financing. Innovative financing is partly a way to address a problem, a fixed cost delta that's still there. Now, you mentioned a different way to address that problem, which is to get into imports at lower cost and have a different source of electrification. But these sectors, building the ecosystem, building the infrastructure to develop all of what you're discussing, there was a demand pull implicitly built into the Inflation Reduction Act with the electric vehicle tax credits. And there was a supply push put into the bill as well for the manufacturing incentives for batteries and components. And the question of whether you can have a supply push that works without the demand pull or without even as much of a supply push, it looks like it's not as clear. So there was a
We'll
sector,
see.
an obvious sector to
We'll
develop
see.
if you wanted to build this out. And we're not accelerating it, that's for sure.
Yeah, I don't know that we ever needed the $7,500 tax credit. I had to keep my mouth shut while I was serving, but like my sense is that people like to go 0 to 60 in 2 seconds with a car that's relatively cheap. I think I think electric vehicles are fine. We just, need to get through whatever the 12 months of people remembering that they're giving up the $7,500 tax credit, and then most people will forget it ever existed and they'll move on to their merry ways. Well, I think the summary of this conversation is less Ozempic, more time in the gym.
Here, here.
Thanks
You
for
first.
joining us, Kevin. It's honestly just such a pleasure, and look forward to learning more from you in the future.
Thanks for having me. Great to be here.
That was a great conversation with Kevin Book. I understood most of it, which I feel like is a win. I do know that a lot of people take notes during your podcast recordings and look things up later. So listen, I'm not above it either. One thing that really stuck out to me was how he was discussing how Chinese EVs are really starting to take hold in Canada. And I'm very curious about Chinese EVs. I hear they're incredible. There was a great Wall Street Journal article in the last couple of weeks where a reporter actually had one in the US and got to test drive it for a couple of weeks, and she was thoroughly impressed. So what was your thinking on that? Like, is the US next?
Well, I mean, first of all, Kevin is absolutely as thorough an analyst as you're going to find. And so that certainly came out of the interview. Look, I think that when you think about how important the US auto industry has been, right? Like we converted all of our auto manufacturing facilities into war manufacturing facilities during World War II. When you think about our Defense Department and how important our automotive supply chain is to our Defense Department, and that's not just in Detroit or in Kentucky or Tennessee or Georgia, it also goes into Ontario, right? And so Canada is part of our automotive supply chain. And so that's why they added tariffs on Chinese EVs when we asked them to, when the Biden administration added tariffs on Chinese EVs. So for them to reverse course and to thumb our noses on these tariffs, that's a small number of vehicles right now, but like it's kind of a big deal.
And I saw that the Chinese government is actually suing the US government over these tariffs, and so I guess we'll see what happens with that. But I mean, more EVs, there are pluses and minuses to that, but I think more electric vehicles on the road, as somebody with severe asthma, that's great for me. Just thinking about like air pollution midsummer. I mean, there's so many waterfall effects of a move to electric vehicles, but that's one that I know would immediately positively impact my life.
Well, I mean, local emissions are all about auto emissions, right? Like in your neighborhood. And so, moving to EVs is such a big deal for sure. But I think the bigger thing about all of this stuff is that when you have these kinds of tools available to governments and they know that like scaling up EVs or scaling up other solutions can actually reduce the cost of oil, right? Because oil prices are an approximation of what people think the supply and demand picture looks like in the future. Then that gives you real power. And people haven't felt real power in helping to determine the price of oil for a very, very long time. And so I think it's a fascinating thing that China is really like leaning all in on EVs, and Canada, who has a pretty large and thriving petroleum industry, is also pushing EVs pretty hard.
Yeah, I mean, it makes you really wonder why the United States is such an outlier. Like, what do you think is holding us back?
Well, we certainly weren't held back for a while. I mean, Tesla was born here in the United States. Was born in California. When you think about, even as large as California's economy is, the number one exporter in the entire state of California is Tesla. So, I mean, it's a pretty big deal. That being said, we've lost our leadership, right? We've allowed ourselves to get, cajoled by the Chinese to give them our technology. That's what Tesla did when they built their facility in Shanghai. And then they have put a lot of money into scaling up, right? And they have a huge domestic market within which to come out with year after year of improved designs, right? Which the United States is starting to get a really large market, but it's still far behind where China is. And so it's a tough thing.
Well, here in the US, people seem to be like very, very committed to maintaining their internal combustion engines. So, what do you think? Are markets just underestimating the impact of electrification? Like, what's happening here, particularly when we look at Venezuela and this effort to get American energy companies to go back in and dramatically scale up production? You know, it's a mismatch. I don't really see what the long term ramifications will be of this disconnect.
Look, Americans like big cars. Like when you go to school drop off here in Bethesda, Maryland, right? Every single person has an SUV except for me and my little electric vehicle. And, like they feel safe that way. They've got one child, but they have a car that seats seven. And they have a gas guzzler. That's why I think we're probably going to move to plug-in hybrids over pure electric vehicles, because to move those SUVs with a pure electric vehicle is probably a 125 kilowatt hour battery pack, which is twice the size of the battery pack that I have in my car. But and that makes the car more expensive, right? And so I think a lot of folks, like Stellantis, for instance, has really gone all in on having a plug-in hybrid version of every one of their cars, and people really like it because they generally drive less than 50 miles a day, and so that 50-mile range takes you most of the way of what you want to do that day, and then gasoline kicks in every once in a while. And so I think the U.S. is going to take its own path. I don't think we're going to be a pure EV society for a long time. Just 'cause people like, you know, a Ford F-150 pickup truck, even though they are not towing anything, or they're taking it to the mall, like they still want one. Okay. Like, but I think if you make it a plug-in hybrid, you can get away with it. But I think for a long time, we've had all these pure EV enthusiasts who have prevented those models from coming out, but I think they're coming out now.
So Americans want their oil. We're going into Venezuela. We're getting even more. Prices are low, not low enough. President Trump wants to continue to slash gas prices. So if we follow this path, like what's next? Is it Cuba? Like where do we go from here?
Venezuela, I'm pretty sure that we're going to cut them off, right, from Venezuela oil. So I think Cuba is going to have to figure out what to do, right? Because Cuba was getting that oil for free from Venezuela, right? And I don't think President Trump's going to sell it to them for free. So we'll see where this whole thing goes. But I feel like what's more important is that the technologies that have been, you know, commercialized really over the last like 2 decades are real solutions. So you can imagine Cuba going all electric vehicles very quickly because they're cut off from oil. You can imagine Cuba deciding that they want to really electrify everything, right? Because that's what they can get access to, right? And so I'm not sure where this goes, but I do think that in general, the time when people were using petroleum as a way to control other countries is coming to an end because there are alternatives. There are other technologies that people can switch to.
Well, let's hope that you're right, Jigger. But if the U.S. does invade Cuba, we'll have to have Kevin Book back on to give us his hot take on that.
Oh, I'm sure we're going to have him back on again. He is a big thinker and very important advisor to many people here in DC.
Thanks for listening to Energy Empire. Please review us on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. It really makes a difference. And you can reach us at energyempire.fm.